This was the technology of our hidden history. Far more than decorative purpose and looks went into the design of these buildings from our hidden past. They all had purpose in generating free energy from the ether above and spreading it throughout the realm. We are far from the most advanced civilization that has ever walked this realm. We are merely the inheritors, living in a post-apocalyptic realm. The evidence of greatness left all around us. Research the mud flood and fall of Tartaria. Question everything, friends.
In recent years, there is a narrative about a country that has vanished from history's pages. A nation that was once well known across the world is now lost in the sands of time. Tartaria, Tartary, or Grand Tartaria, has perplexed web academics digging through antique maps dating back to the 15th century. The Tartar Empire is a mystery to historians. The empire was first mentioned in the year 635 by a Byzantine historian, Procopius of Caesarea. He mentions that the emperor of the Tartars had been defeated by Chosroes of Persia, and his son Kavadr, Gangu, had been captured. He writes that the emperor's name was unknown, but he knew that he ruled over an empire with many tribes and provinces. He also knew that they were located in what we know as Eastern Europe, Western Siberia, and Central Asia today. What is now known as Tartary is not an easy place to get to from Constantinople, so it is unclear how Procopius got all this information about them, if he never visited these lands himself, or if he did, why he didn't mention. Fasten up and join us as we investigate the beginnings of the mighty Tartarian Empire, proof of a lost empire. Tartarian's existence is founded on 4 pillars. From the mid-13th century through the 19th century, Tartary was a general word encompassing northern Asia, including modern-day Russia, the remains of civilization, according to Tartarian truthers, rather than a general word relating to different people groupings. Another crucial component of this idea is the mudslide. The subterranean window wells and cellar entrances of houses from the period are cited by Tartarian conspiracy theorists. The architectural styles known as Beaux-Arts and Second Empire are the most extensive proof of Tartaria. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, architecture was renowned internationally. Surprisingly, a tendency known as brutalism emerged shortly after these forms, in which buildings were constructed only as utilitarian constructions that were frequently exceedingly boring. According to Tartarian truthers, our civilization was not evolved enough to establish the Beaux-Arts style, so we repurposed these artifacts from an old society. The theory's final edge is constructed by modifying texts from the Christian Bible to suit the theorist's needs. These explanations are a little shaky, but they aid in the development of more imaginative theories. Was the history or Tartaria deleted? According to Wikipedia, Tartaria was a generic word for the Tartars, and Europeans had little understanding of them. But the book written by Giovanni da Pian del Carpine in 1252 contains a considerable study on the Tartars and their kingdom, theoretical levels. The Tartarian legend has numerous levels. The first, nearly common element is that a powerful empire in northern Asia has perished through the passage of time. The second hidden tier is that this empire ruled over the whole planet, establishing a one-world or almost one-world governance. The final level is that this empire was not only vast but also technically sophisticated. They possess technology unlike anything we can fathom, and society's design demonstrates their enormous capabilities. The variants of the theory are intriguing to say the least. Tartary had its own language, flag, crest, its own emperor, and of course its own people universal language. Tartary, a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia on the north and west. This is called Great Tartary. The Tartars who lie south of Muscovy and Siberia are those of Astrakhan, Circassia, and Dagestan, situated northwest of the Caspian Sea. The Kalmyk Tatars, who lie between Siberia and the Caspian Sea. The Uzbek Tatars and Moguls, who lie north of Persia and India. And lastly, those of Tibet, who lie northwest of China. Encyclopedia Britannica. Greek mythology, Tartarus is both a deity and a place in the underworld. In ancient Orphic sources and in the mystery schools, Tartarus is also the unbounded first existing entity from which the light and the cosmos are born. In the Greek poet Hesiod's Theogony, c. 700 BC, Tartarus was the third of the primordial deities, following after Chaos and Gaia, Earth, and preceding Eros, and was the father, by Gaia, of the monster Typhon. According to Hyginus, Tartarus was the offspring of Aetha and Gaia. Roman mythology. In Roman mythology, Tartarus is the place where sinners are sent. Virgil describes it in the Aeneid as a gigantic place, surrounded by the flaming river Phlegethon and triple walls to prevent sinners from escaping from it. It is guarded by a hydra with 50 black gaping jaws, which sits at a screeching gate protected by columns of solid adamantine, a substance akin to diamond, so hard that nothing will cut through it. Inside, there is a castle with wide walls and a tall iron turret. Tisiphone, one of the Erinyes who represents revenge, stands guard sleepless at the top of this turret lashing a whip. There is a pit inside which is said to extend down into the earth twice as far as the distance from the lands of the living to Olympus. Tartarians cover-up. Tartarian researchers claim a slew of incidents as proof of a cover-up campaign for Tartaria's dominion. Most late 19th century battles were viewed as attempts to demolish most of the surviving buildings. Followers also look at World's Fairs from the same time period and infer that the magnificent structures erected for these occasions were not constructed. Instead, these were Tartarian standing buildings. Governments aiming to obliterate Tartaria from history constructed the World's Fair in such a way that they could demolish these structures without raising suspicion. Last words. Tartarian's notion is extremely intriguing. If accurate, it would cast doubt on much of history and modify our perceptions of ourselves. However, many of the reasons in favor of such a society are based on speculation. As fascinating as it would be to have preceded us by a highly advanced race of giants, we need more evidence to support this theory. Questioning is an essential component of research. All major discoveries stem from a desire to learn more, a knowledge that what we know is insufficient, curiosity, and a desire to learn more about issues about which we know little is a positive thing, but it shouldn't lead to haphazard guesswork. That is why the scientific process exists. You double-check facts and data, peer review papers, discuss hypotheses with experts, and have academic conversations. It's quite intriguing to say the least. As a result, we'll leave it up to you to determine what you think of this long-lost kingdom. Stay tuned for more next time. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up icon. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notifications for new videos.
How can we be certain that the history we have been taught is completely true, or that societies evolved as our culture has taught us they did? Independent researchers from all around the world are shedding new light on this topic, and the mystery gets deeper every day. Did the planet once host highly developed civilizations? We are fascinated by the past and its mysteries, from presumed lost continents to ancient cities with impossibly stunning architecture. But it's crucial to have an objective view of the evidence that can be uncovered to distinguish between fact and fiction. With this in mind, what if we told you that there was an empire greater than Britain and greater than Rome? And what if this empire has largely been forgotten in the throes of history? Tartaria was the name of a pre-Mongolian empire that began in northern Asia before spreading throughout the entire northern hemisphere. According to legend, the Tartarian Empire prospered and may have used advanced technologies such as free energy, developed cutting-edge multifaceted systems, and built the most opulent and astounding architecture. Online researchers have been perplexed by the Tartarians as they delve through historical maps from as far back as the 15th century and beyond. The Tartarian theory is currently seen as though the history of human societies and culture has been purposefully obscured. Online study, and to a large degree, speculation on this topic has led researchers to develop some intriguing theories and points of view. There is an important point that we will reiterate throughout this series. We will be talking about the actual Tartarian Empire at times, but also about the Tartarian Old World theory, which is multifaceted and doesn't always have to do with the Tartarian Empire. It is important to distinguish the difference between the Tartarian Empire and the Tartarian theory as they overlap, but are not exclusive of each other. Keep this in mind as we take you down the rabbit hole. One of the oldest mentions of Tartaria dates back to 1252 when Giovanni da Pian del Carpine wrote the book. The story of the Mongols, whom we call the Tartars. In the very first chapter, he describes very vividly the details about Tartaria, including the landscape, the people, the culture, and even waging war against them. It is important to note that in the first chapters of this book, the inhabitants of Tartary are described in a different way from that of a highly advanced society of the past. It is mentioned, for example, that the climatic conditions of the Tartary region were very harsh for the sustenance of life. Furthermore, that the inhabitants of Tartary, although they were friendly among themselves, showed hostility with those who were not part of the empire. The fact that Tartaria is also the source of the Greek term Tartarus is significant and intriguing. The Tartarian Empire is thought to have been buried and eradicated during a cataclysm like a mud flood, which is why the Greeks used the term Tartarus to refer to the underworld, where lost souls spend eternity. The Tartarians, or Tartars, were an indigenous people who, at some point in history, were united into a large society that eventually developed into a great empire with a global reputation. According to legend, the Tartarians were exceptionally tall people, with some possibly standing 8 to 12 feet tall on average. To our modern average height of only about 6 feet, they would have been giants. This leads us to some important questions. Why were they completely wiped off the map? What happened to this great empire? It is said to have been possibly a single country split into multiple different smaller civilizations. These include Petite Tartary, Eastern Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and even Russian Tartary. There are multiple examples of old maps showing huge swaths of land with depictions of big cities throughout the empire. Where did these cities go, and what kind of technology did they use to build highly articulate architectural structures? We can see all kinds of antiquitech on these buildings. What were the true purpose of these spires on top of old buildings? The theory suggests that they were used to tap into free energy in the ether. Internet researchers have been making some wild claims, but one of the most interesting is that many of the modern cities we inhabit today were here long before us. At some point, as speculators have mentioned, our modern society showed up and began to inhabit them. Perhaps the orphans of the 1800s were sent to North America to inhabit the empty cities. Was there already a major societal reset and we don't even know it? Were horse and buggy societies of years ago truly capable of building some of these architectural marvels? These may not even be in Europe, but can be as far east as Asia and even in North America. Perhaps a better way of putting it is that the civilization of Tartary is literally the civilization buried under us. As the Greeks would have put it, Tartary literally meant the underworld. There are legends about creatures of enormous height and physical prowess in this theory. They were not quite Homo sapiens, but they are in virtually every ancient society. The giants. It is interesting to compare the average heights that these races of giants allegedly possessed. In all of the ancient legends, The giants are exterminated from the earth following a global catastrophe that wipes out their culture and some signs of their transit across the globe. This is another distinguishing feature of the analysis of the giants. We can take a look at old architecture from around the world. Were some of these buildings and cathedrals really built for 6-foot-tall humans? Doors look like they were designed for giants. Great halls and places of worship with ceilings so high it would be unimaginable to build something like that today for the price at the time. The doors at Santa Cruz would seem to be built for something we haven't seen on this world at all. Why would the architects do this? Was it really our society that built these structures? Did this ancient society have a bigger reach around the globe than we may have originally thought? There are countless examples of very similar symbols, architecture, maps, and general knowledge that can be found in impossible locations across the globe. The similarities can be found before humans were known to even travel such large distances. How did this knowledge move around the world so quickly? Why can we find examples of this in so many different places today? As the theory goes, the old world empire had technology not known to us and were far more advanced than we think. Throughout the 19th century there were a number of world's fairs in the modern era. Whether in Europe or North America, most people have heard of world's fairs. What was their intended purpose, though? As internet researchers have noted, these world's fairs were unbelievably expensive for the time. Who foot the bill for these feats of construction? According to history, it was mostly private business owners that paid to build hundreds of structures and buildings in these world's fairs. Take the Centennial Exposition of 1876 in Philadelphia. The main building itself enclosed a jaw-dropping 21.5 acres of space. It measured 464 feet by 1880 feet long. Would anyone build such a structure these days only to tear it down? Yes, they were temporary buildings, and eventually most were torn down. What's so intriguing about this is why would profit-oriented business barons be interested in spending fortunes to build huge cities worth of temporary buildings? As one online researcher put it, these buildings were so extravagant they cost a fortune to build, but generally, according to history, hundreds of them were built within only a year or two. This would be astounding by today's standards. Further, these huge and expensive world's fairs were all operated at a loss. If society still had these today, who would pay for it? Do these buildings look temporary? What really is strange is that there aren't many photos of the construction of these world's fairs. Mostly only deconstruction photos. Apparently, many people attended these. You can look at the population of some of the cities they were built in at the time, and it was only a few thousand people. Why would they do this for only a few thousand people? Who had the skills to build these structures in a horse and buggy society? Is it possible that the orphan trains and boats of the 19th century were used to populate the New World? As some researchers have claimed, the cities already existed, and if populated by orphans, humanity would essentially suffer a collective memory loss. Even insane asylums at the time were overboard for the populations they served. Were there an abundance of people that needed to go to insane asylums? The architecture for these places, just as in previously mentioned locations, is over and above what would be required for an insane asylum. We do believe that there was a great union of tribes of common origin, which ended up inhabiting a large area of land, and whether they were unified in an empire, they surpassed the size of any other. Among some of the details concerning the theory, it is mentioned, for example, that the great structures of the Tartars that worked through the ether and that fed their cities are currently used by the great world elites as museums, castles of royalty, and religious sanctuaries. And this would be the reason why these places transmit changes in the energetic vibration of the people who enter. In actuality, if there were any remnants of Tartarian technology and knowledge, they were deliberately hidden. But is it really that easy to hide so much evidence? Did the so-called mud flood occur worldwide? Was the level of the mud from the flood the same in all the regions that it occurred? What happened to the giant inhabitants of Tartary? We will try to summarize some of the latest research in this topic to get a better understanding of our hidden history. Stay tuned for more next time. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up icon. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notifications for new videos. Is it possible that some of the mythical events of the distant past are events of only hundreds of years ago? Is it possible that in many places in the world, even separated from each other, have suffered a flood of sediments that could wipe out an entire civilization? According to researchers, perhaps the cities we live in today are built directly on top of old world cities. Can we fathom that there was a great cataclysm that covered old world buildings, and we simply just started to build right on top of them? According to legend, a significant number of dirt layers were removed, and what we now recognize as the cities we live in emerged from underneath. It is understandable that this is not an official version that is recognized by all historians. But the main premise is that, could an entire civilization be submerged by a mud flood? A mud flood is the sudden movement of a large accumulation of sediment, the product of a terrestrial phenomenon such as a large earthquake or tidal wave. We can go back to the early 1800s to try and understand the possibilities. According to historical accounts, between December of 1811 and March of 1812, there were upwards of 2,000 earthquakes in the central Midwest United States. Could this have been an event that triggered a type of so-called mud flood in North America? Sediment is solid particles that are deposited at the bottom of bodies of water, such as lakes and rivers. Also, as a result of a sufficiently strong storm, from the valleys and mountains near bodies of water, large sediment slides can be produced, and this mud is capable of greatly altering the relief of the area where the flood occurred. Throughout history, in virtually every country in Europe and Asia, there have been records of large mud flows. Having said that, is it possible that the world we see today could be built directly on top of a previous society that we know nothing about? When talking about the Tartaria or Old World Reset theory, one immediately talks about the mud flood. Researchers claim it was responsible for ending an empire, however. Is there more to the story? The main evidence, or allegations, are the large number of semi-sunken buildings throughout the world. It should be noted that, especially in Europe, however, countries like the United States can also find these buildings. These are several excavations which unearthed full buried floors of old buildings complete with doors and windows. There would be no reason to build doors and windows underground. How would it be possible for this much sediment to build up in only a century or so? What buried these buildings so quickly? The main characteristic of these buildings is that, in fact, it seems that one floor of them has been buried in the ground. In many, it is seen as if a half window peeked out from the street floor. These buildings, in general, usually have stairs that make you go up to the floor where you can walk. It would be the second floor of the building. Or, on the contrary, they can have stairs that go down until people walk on the floor, which is sunken. In 1984, some places would even have underground city tours. The depth of which these old world cities are buried is astounding in itself. What happened? Is there another reason these old cities are completely buried under us? Theorists of the old world affirm that the enemies of the previous civilization, being victorious and taking advantage of the calamity that occurred with the old empire, took all the old world technology they could find. It is noteworthy that many of the buried buildings were used as hidden floors, and even some researchers claim that these underground floors were rejoined by the use of roads, thus forming secret hidden underground cities throughout Europe. When analyzing the common patterns of the theory, some researchers emphasize that most of the buildings that we can observe semi-buried have Gothic architecture, are made with red brick. We can find examples of red brick buildings much further into history than previously thought. Is there alternative explanations? The explanation of the cultural layer proposes that, as a result of human activity, elements accumulate in the soil that end up increasing the level of the soil surface. These elements are soil itself, garbage and waste. Archaeological science estimates this accumulation to be around 5 centimeters every 100 years. How can this theory explain the full, multi-story floors of buildings being completely buried underground? Researchers suggest that if these buildings were truly built only 100 or 200 years ago, there to be much less of a sedimentary layer. It is not at all likely that the people who lived in this time noticed that their homes and buildings were sinking in rubbish and simply allowed it to go on for many years. If we remember that the version of the cultural layer increases about 5 centimeters every 100 years, it is impossible that so many buildings around the world have been completely covered in this way. How many thousands of years would it take for the cultural layer to engulf the first floor of a building, and why wouldn't anyone do anything about it? Alternatively, there is another possible explanation of settling. A building can, without a doubt, sink into the ground due to, for example, the violent vibration of the ground caused by an earthquake. There is evidence, too, that cities built in valleys and near rivers are prone to the fact that their soil is not the most apt to support the weight of the city itself indefinitely. In cities located in valleys, subsidence of more than 10 cm per year has been observed. This version, compared to the previous one, sounds more plausible. However, to prove the disappearance of the Old World Empire, an investigation of practically all the earthquakes that occurred in the late 1700s and mid-1800s has to be carried out, which is not impossible, although extremely complicated. The possibility is not ruled out that, in fact, buildings around the world that appear to have windows at ground level may have been intentionally built that way. Consider that it is a strange type of design that was not given much importance, and that was later replicated in the rest of the world. But considering some of the advanced architecture and planning involved in constructing these immense and marvelous buildings that stand the test of time, burying windows and doors would not make too much sense. Online researchers have discovered that there is evidence in a magazine of natural history article that something strange was happening geophysically with the Earth, at least as early as the mid-1700s, and continuing up until the publication of that article in 1834. The article talks about migratory animals getting lost, frequent severe weather events, the aurora borealis being visible at low latitudes, and a change in the winds and ocean currents, to mention a few. At one point, the seas were so unfavorable and perilous that ships were left stranded in foreign ports for at least 3 months before it was decided it was safe to resume cruising. Could this have had an impact on society at the time? Was this part of a larger, unknown cataclysm that we don't know about? Significant meteor showers and increased volcanism are also mentioned as occurring at this time. It was reported that one such shower, which was seen all along the American East Coast, dumped hundreds of thousands of fireballs from dusk until dawn. A geomagnetic anomaly may have been one of the more likely explanations for this phenomenon. Whatever it was, it caused havoc for a span of at least 100 years. While this isn't a definitive explanation of the mud flood theory, it could perhaps be something to consider. The mysteries of our world seem to grow wilder every year. Is there more to history than meets the eye? Stay tuned for more next time. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up icon. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notifications for new videos. Were World's Fairs events held for nations to compete with each other by displaying their goods and inventions to the rest of the world? Or were they actually designed as an excuse to destroy ancient architectural heritage? Since its inception, the World's Fair has performed a variety of functions as an international showcase. The Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all continents was the first trade show, and it took place in London's Hyde Park in 1851. The first World's Fairs took place as the economic revolution extended from England to the United States, and they served as platforms for nations and corporations to show off their industrial prowess and most recent advancements. They were also intended to inspire confidence in a populace that was still adjusting to the idea that many of the products they used on a daily basis were now produced by machines rather than by hand. Is it possible, though, that the creation of the World Fairs were done so that they would merely serve as a guise for a cover-up? According to theories put forth by the 1800s cultural reset, the locations and massive structures that were ostensibly built for the holding of the World Fairs were, in fact, hundreds of years old and remnants of a collective culture that has since vanished. Was it just a way to introduce the architecture to the masses and then paved way for a legitimate excuse to tear the structures down? We'll use the San Francisco-Panama Pacific International Exposition as an example to bring the premise into focus. The massive fair, which spanned over 2.5 miles of waterfront land and encompassed more than 600 acres, emphasized San Francisco's splendor and honored a significant American accomplishment: the successful completion of the Panama Canal. One of America's deadliest natural disasters was the devastating earthquake that struck San Francisco 9 years prior. When the exposition opened in 1915, the city had overcome significant obstacles and was prepared to receive visitors from all over the world. Without a doubt, the architectural design used for the construction of the fair-designated area was magnificent. One example of this is the Palace of Fine Arts, which was built in 1915. Something that first stands out is the construction's geometrical perfectionist style, which is very impressive and beautiful. However, something jumps out at you when you look at photos of the structures built for several global expos. Why do they look older than they should? Why did they spend so much time and energy on the incredibly detailed old world-style architecture? Some researchers have been able to determine that in some dated photographs, certain buildings and statues that complement them appear older rather than more recently constructed. Furthermore, is it appropriate to ask the question, why build sites and complexes that are so astounding only to destroy them in a matter of months? According to the accepted and official history, most of these buildings and monuments were constructed using straightforward structures and lightweight materials, and they were intended to last just for the duration of the fairs. However, some of these large architectural works are still standing today, which goes against the conventional knowledge associated with international trade shows to demolish everything related to the show after it closes. It is true that many buildings were constructed using flimsy materials, but it was obvious that not all of them were. Instead, some were buildings that had been built on their own. It is unfortunate that none of these buildings are still standing because they were all eventually destroyed, except for a select few. Finishing with the case of the Panama Pacific International Exhibition, it seems appropriate to ask whether the practice of building temporary structures close to longer, lasting ones that would otherwise remain in place had it not been for intentional destruction was repeated in other years at other international expositions. Does it make sense that such massive structures would be created just for that occasion, and then so quickly dismantled? The World Fairs may have been a ruse to destroy the remnants of ancient, advanced cities that formerly belonged to a previous empire we may know little about. The organizers might have ordered the destruction of the architecture on the grounds that, after the fairs, it was necessary to dismantle the area, buildings, and decorations. Localities like those chosen in San Francisco, according to the theory of the reset of the 1800s, were in fact cities built according to the typical imperial code of geometry and sacred engineering, with the intention that such structures would alter the state of mind of a new generation of inhabitants. If the Great Reset of the 1800s occurred as described, it would be logical to assume that some of the city's initial residents would have known that those magnificent monuments had been built, most likely by their ancestors, hundreds of years prior. Did the citizens of these cities not object against the destruction of these buildings? We can speculate that this is possible, but it is unlikely that we will learn whether anyone objected to the entire operation that was the World Fairs. Perhaps insane asylums were used to ensure there was no objection. We will go in more depth on that in the future. Is there a group of powerful people that decide what types of architecture the world will keep and how it will be received? The story will be told by the winners and taken as true if written or visual records are not preserved. Families may have been split up as a method of ensuring that the original residents' resettlement was complete. From the most industrialized to the most rural areas of the country, orphans were taken as and sent via trains, while parents were being moved around in other locations. Were families subject to treatments that caused them to lose their identity and cultural heritage? Or did they just disappear? Is a global catastrophe required for humanity to forget an ancient culture? Actually, all that must be done is to convince people that this civilization is a part of a larger myth and conceal, or in this case, destroy, the evidence. Do those who wish to conceal the origins of humanity and society intend to gradually erase history? Or is there more to the story that we are not being told? Stay tuned for more next time. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up icon. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notifications for new videos. Is it possible that the energy we need every day to continue as a productive society could be free and available at all times? Is it possible that the ability to move energy freely in the ether was a reality in the past, and that physical wires were not needed to transmit electricity from point A to point B? According to researchers and old world reset theorists, this may have been the norm in a not too distant past. Let's take a look and highlight the term. Antiquitech refers to unknown technology we may see evidence of on structures and buildings of the past, perhaps even to move energy throughout the realm. Could the use of magnets, sacred geometry, or water that gathers etheric energy be the method used by a previous lost civilization? Combine this with highly advanced ancient technology which may have been lost with a previous generation unknown to us, and we may find some answers in the buildings right in front of us. In these handfuls of ideas, we find that the definition of the concept has made it clear that the methods for the use of electricity or energy through an architectural medium, a building intelligently built for such purposes, is achieved using geometry, water, or magnetism. Within the theory of the Lost Empire and Old World Reset, it is interesting to observe the way in which temples, buildings, and star forts comply with the characteristics of being built through a sacred geometric design and are located near abundant water sources. Is there a hidden technology we have lost as a society in the sands of time? How can we be certain these overbuilt, unnecessary details on history's architecture had no other purpose other than decoration? According to the theory of the Great Cultural Reset of the 1800s, the Old World Empire, who were the inhabitants of a lost legendary worldwide civilization, were masters of masonry technology, unlimited free energy, and magnificent architecture. In fact, the Roman Gothic architectural style, which is still visible in town halls, banks, water stations, cathedrals, churches, hospitals, and other comparable public and urban buildings, possibly has more ancient origins. The Old World inhabitants, being possessors of a very advanced ancestral knowledge, designed intelligent buildings that worked in conjunction with the vibrations of one's consciousness, Mother Nature, and possibly sound itself, using sacred engineering and architecture and possessing the knowledge of metaphysical geometry and sacred mathematics. The Old World Empire designed complex buildings that efficiently channeled the energy of the earth, or the ether, that is in the air at all times. How they did this is not completely understood today, but the evidence of intelligent construction of these buildings could indicate that the ether was channeled and retransmitted within the structure, being absorbed by the people around it. Let's use the St. Walburgis Church in Zutphen, Netherlands as an example. Do these spires on the top of the cathedral look like they are only decorative? They almost resemble a type of electric coil, designed in a way to harness some sort of energy. Perhaps these are deliberately constructed and placed in these locations to harness a certain type of energy that we may no longer have the knowledge to create. There are countless other examples, and they can span in completely different locations around the globe. Deventer in the Netherlands, Cathedral of St. Mary in Spain, Cathedral of St. Michael in Belgium. The Strasbourg Cathedral is an example with completely mind-boggling architecture and antiquity all over it. Something remarkable is that many of the ancient buildings that are associated with this supposed lost empire are located in, or very close to, ley lines, which are sections of the earth where the terrestrial energy circulates in a regular, direct, and uninterrupted flow that can be intentionally harnessed. These structures built on ley lines can date back thousands of years. Just like we have our own energy centers or chakras, Mother Earth also has hers. When you start looking into the nature of this universe and the earth, we start seeing how everything is a mirror. Within us is a universe. Around us is a universe, and we are all connected. We are connected to Mother Earth through the subtle electrical current that runs around the entire planet. These electrical currents are known as ley lines and are almost like Mother Earth's veins. Just like we have veins that flow in and out of the heart, Mother Earth has ley lines, which are lines of energy that coil around the earth in a similar fashion. In fact, where the ley lines intersect are believed to be high points of energy or high concentrations of electrical charge. These lines are also said to be able to take information or energy from these higher vibrational points and carry them around the world. These intersecting points along the ley lines are also coincidentally home to some of the most sacred temples and monuments in the world. When you look into ancient civilizations, it is clear that they seem to understand the energy and power of ley lines. Were the structures of the old world reset designed to harness the same energy? Currently, the effort and production cost of a building with such features would be exorbitant. In addition to the fact that even with the largest cranes and equipment, it is not guaranteed that such great architectural feats could be carried out, and much less that they possess the physical qualities and energetic qualities harnessed by the original buildings and monuments of the old world. Even the Taj Mahal in India dons countless examples of possible antiquity on its exterior. Was it used to tap into free energy in the ether? Perhaps the purpose of many of the great obelisks and enormous Gothic-style towers of the world were to function as antennas that canalized the energy below the ground and floating in the air, and then retransmitted it to the next tower or obelisk in ways more or less similar to a Tesla tower. In old world cities, were lighthouse systems and homes illuminated in the same way? Did the cities not have any type of wiring for the transmission of energy? In addition, as it emanated directly from the earth, this energy is thought to have been completely clean, so it did not harm the environment and help nourish the people who were under the influence of the energy channeled by the structures within them. Why does our technology and knowledge of sacred engineering, geometry, and architecture seem to have regressed? Why would it be impossible for us to build great monuments and buildings like those of past centuries? Why did we abandon the construction methods that possibly used free energy from the earth? It is hardly credible that, after thousands of years building monuments and cities under these premises, we have simply considered it of little use from one day to the next. Perhaps everything is not what it may seem, so that we no longer have access to technological buildings and structures that could help expand our consciousness and harness the free energy of the earth. Stay tuned for more next time. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up icon. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notifications for new videos. Giants. Did they really exist? It might not be so simple to answer, even though most people would undoubtedly laugh at the question. In addition to descriptions of these giants appearing in our ancient writings and artifacts, actual proof of giant remains, such as fossilized footprints and bones, have perhaps been discovered all over the planet. Almost every mythology of ancient cultures included giants. When you consider how broad and far-reaching the descriptions of giants were around the world, you may ask whether these societies were documenting historical facts or just ancient folklore legends. The scale of giants, their often violent behavior, and the fact that they engaged in fierce combat and conflicts with gods appear to be common motifs in the myths of different cultures. Another noteworthy fact is that it is always mentioned that the giants were hybrids between these gods and humans. Large megalithic buildings were attributed to the giants by many cultures. They were frequently reported to have arrived by boat. Additionally, numerous sources show that the catastrophic universal flood largely wiped them out. In an excerpt from the Arizona Silver Belt, November 16, 1895, with the headline Prehistoric Egyptian Giants, the author wrote, "In 1881, when Professor Timmerman was engaged in exploring the ruins of an ancient temple of Isis on the banks of the Nile, 16 miles below Nézerdísfard, he opened a row of tombs in which some prehistoric race of giants had been buried. The smallest skeleton out of some 60-odd, which were examined during the time Timmerman was excavating at Nézerdísfard, measured 7 feet 8 inches in length and the largest 11 feet 1 inch tall. These beings of extraordinary height have been the protagonists of countless legends. Among some well-documented are those of American tribes that describe ancient races of giants that inhabited the entire American continent prior to the arrival of Europeans. In addition to possessing existing working and efficient cities or towns, the Comanches were one of the tribes that occupied the Great Plains. They have records of a race of extraordinarily tall men, about 10 feet tall. Apparently, they were a tribe of very rich and powerful men, even much more than any civilization today. In addition, they covered a good part of the region that they inhabited in huge cities. These tribes had walls and great mountains that surrounded the cities where they resided. Further, the legend of the Paiutes tells of a race of red-haired cannibals who were located near Lovelock's Cave in present-day Nevada, United States. However, until now it is not known for sure if the stories about these giants are true or if they are an exaggeration of history. In 1931, large skeletons were said to have been found in the bed of Lake Humboldt, approximately 20 miles from Lovelock. The first of these two skeletons found is reportedly 2.5 meters tall and appeared to have been wrapped in a covered cloth like the way ancient Egyptians wrapped their mummies. The writer Horace Bardwell Cushman wrote in 1889 about this particular culture called the Choctaw. In his book titled History of the Choctaw, Chickasaw and Natchez Indians, he talks about a race of giant men who lived in what is now Tennessee. It is said that the Naholo people boasted members of extraordinary stature. Cushman said in his book that the word Naholo was used to speak of certain types of men. However, he clarified that he was originally referring to the race of giants that the Choctaw encountered upon reaching the Mississippi. To quote author J. Lee, he mentions in his book about the greatest civilization ever to be erased from history. There's been a major cover-up by Western archaeological institutions since the early 1900s to make us believe that America was first colonized by Asian peoples migrating through the Bering Strait 15,000 years ago, when in fact, there are hundreds of thousands of burial mounds all over America, which the natives claim were there a long time before them, and that show traces of a highly developed civilization, complex use of metal alloys, and where giant human skeleton remains are frequently found, but still go unreported in the media and news outlets. These are just a few examples, since, as mentioned in the introduction, in all the ancient cultures of the world, giant beings are referenced. These are supposedly giants that built the greatest works of the ancient world, which even today would be very difficult to replicate. Depending on the region of Europe where some of the legends come from, there are different names for giants. In the Bosio-Rule area, giants are known as Tartari, for example. Within the theory of the Great Cultural Reset, there are several peculiarities that incline us to question whether, in a remote past, a great empire was originally founded and inhabited by giants. Humanoid beings of exceptional size and strength, who also possessed a very advanced knowledge of masonry that allowed them to build enormous cities and stone monuments that, even today, cannot be replicated. Why would such massive cities and buildings be built for average-sized humans? Why would such high and wide gates and doors be built in cathedrals and old-world buildings? Why are the ceilings of ancient cathedrals and temples so tall? Is there a possibility that they were simply built specifically for giants, and that this was the secret of the splendor of this lost empire? Ancient records of Arabic origin, which detail the way in which buildings and temples should be built, that date back to the 1700s, say that the doors and roofs must be particularly high and wide to allow access for a man mounted on a camel, carrying a load. Does this really explain the incredibly oversized doors and ceilings in some of these old-world buildings? The man on the camel had to be able to comfortably enter the building without having to get off his animal or lower his head. In other parts of the world, such as India, there are also similar records, but they detail that the entrances of the temples had to be even larger, to allow the passage of the most used animal for the construction of these buildings, which were elephants. Is this a valid explanation for the opulent and astoundingly exorbitant architecture of the old world? Elephants were the power of load and push of ancient India and many other places in the ancient world, allowing the transport of large amounts of material, dragging it to its destination. For conventional science, this will be unbelievable, since in many places where there are large buildings there were no elephants or animals this large, but that is only part of the narrative we have come to understand today. Within the old world reset theory, it is casually mentioned that the lands that currently make up the United States were inhabited by large beings, of which only some remnants have been found. In addition, another point that coincides with the cultural reset theory is that the North American giants, and in fact the rest of the world, had a host of different physical features and distinctions, as well as the described giants of the Lost Empire. Why would artifacts such as books or weapons of enormous dimensions be built? Just for an aesthetic taste that seeks to increase the symbolism of the piece? Or was it so that people who were enormous in stature could simply use them? We may never know the whole truth about the giants, but between myth, legend, and historical fact, there is more to the story than meets the eye. Can buildings, depending on how they are designed and built, change the state of mind and mood of the people inside them? Is it possible that expert minds know how to harness the natural energies of the planet through megastructures and sacred geometry? For hundreds of years, A great number of beautiful buildings known as star forts, also known as bastion forts, adorn our planet like jewelry when we look at them from the sky. Nowadays, it is very rare to find much information about these star-like buildings, despite being a phenomenon that is found all over the world. Michelangelo, the great Italian artist, was the creator of the original design for star forts, in an attempt to improve the defensive earthworks of Florence around the year 1520. In the following century, architects Baldassare Peruzzi and Vincenzo Scamozzi developed even more of Michelangelo's design. This construction model quickly became popular across Europe once it was exported from Italy in the 1530s and 40s. It continued to do so for the next 3 centuries. The term bastion fort can also be used to refer to star forts. These are military fortifications designed in a style that developed during the era of gunpowder, when the cannon came to dominate the battlefield in the middle of the 15th century in Italy. Before the advent of cannons, castles and cities were protected using a circular-type fence, which later proved not to be the most efficient in eliminating attackers. It left many blind spots available as long as the enemies were very close to the high walls. The star fort served as a response to the need to better defend the cities, for which the entire concept of fortification was redesigned. The star forts are characterized by overlapping triangular structures, or, as the name indicates, a star-type form. Sometimes large ditches or water channels were built around the fort to further protect it. The star forts were built higher than the ground level or even right at sea level, with an angle inclined inward. In this way, any attacks were more likely to hit the ground and not the walls. It is said that the star fort's acute angles served to eliminate dead zones. These were locations that could not be fired upon due to the angle of the fort's rounded turrets, which allowed the adversary to undermine the castle walls. Historians assure us that the fort's peculiar shape helped the people in charge of them cover the dead zones for protection during battles. But is there more to the star forts than mainstream history leads us to believe? Star forts were a type of building originally designed by the minds of the great master architects and masons of a previous empire. These structures, in addition to any military purpose they might have, performed a superior function. Was there more than meets the eye to the design of the star fort? How were these societies able to construct such marvelous and advanced structures using ancient and sacred geometry? It is important to examine what the purpose of the buildings were, since there might be some very useful information contained inside these incredible structures. According to online researchers, 336 star forts have been discovered in the world so far. However, it is very likely that many remain unfound or have been completely covered by a previous mud flood type event. This number is surprising, since practically on every continent there are star forts. Were these forts designed so efficiently that their construction methods spread so quickly around the world? How was the knowledge shared across seas and continents so long ago? Some researchers conclude that the construction methods for all these forts must have been the same, or the information on how to build them prodigiously spread rapidly throughout the ancient world. Alternatively, were they all built by the same advanced civilization? A global empire, if you will? As we could already guess, most star forts share many similarities with each other, the most notable being that they are all built near large bodies of water, such as coasts, lakes, or rivers. Researchers of the Old World reset theory conclude that the star forts are built on terrestrial power lines or guidelines. These are built in specific locations containing large amounts of etheric energy of the Earth. Let's examine the role of water and frequency in these star fort designs. When a particle of water is examined with a microscope and subjected to a specific vibrational frequency, the particles adopt a geometric shape. The shape that the particles take on is dependent on the frequency that was applied. The tests that were conducted by Masaru Emoto, a Japanese author, scholar, and researcher, are given as an illustration of this idea. In 1994, he collected samples from a pristine water source in Japan, froze a few drops of the water, and then analyzed the frozen drops using an electron microscope. The images presented stunning examples of crystalline hexagons that resembled snowflakes. Similarly, audio frequencies on grains of particles can create the most stunning geometric designs. These designs can be found in the ancient architecture found across our realm. Emoto then took water from a polluted river, froze it, photographed a few drops of it, and verified that the image that appeared in them was not a lovely hexagon, but rather an unstructured shape, as if the water were sensitive to the environment in which it was situated. Can we focus energy on particles of natural material and affect it with how we live on this planet and how we conduct ourselves? His studies did not end there. Rather, he continued to explain how ideas, emotions, language, music, and other stimuli alter the geometric molecular structure of water in our bodies. Emoto carried out a series of experiments on pure water droplet samples to investigate their properties. Through the application of external stimuli to the samples, he was able to identify that music, words, intentions, projected thoughts, and emotions are all perceived by the water particles, and that the water particles change their shape depending on how they are perceived. There was a significant gap between the droplet samples that were exposed to pleasant stimuli, such as music, flattery, and well wishes, and those that were subjected to negative stimuli, such as criticism, loud sounds, insults, bad wishes. It was discovered that when water is subjected to favorable stimuli or a high vibratory frequency, such as thoughts, it alters its physiognomy, and the water's particles take on a hexagonal geometric shape. A great number of the other formations taken by the water samples are reminiscent of the patterns utilized in star forts. Were the designs of these star forts really meant to convey a certain type of meditative mental state of the inhabitants around it? Were they able to provide a level of protection unknown to the common man, and as such, were designed in this way? Being built near water sources or on ley lines, the structures were designed with engineering based on sacred geometry. It channeled the terrestrial ether and redistributed it in the form of a resonance that tuned the energy of the ether of the earth and channeled it within the walls of the fortification. This may have altered the state of consciousness and mood of the residents of the interior and helped them with this to remain healthy, lucid, and nourished by the energy of the earth. Let us remember that, in the stories of the old world reset, it is said that they fed precisely on the ether of the earth. Can we ever replicate anything remotely like this today? Early in the 19th century, America had essentially no knowledge for treatment of the mentally ill, who were typically housed in prisons or under the insufficient supervision of their relatives. If treatment was given, it was like other therapies used at that period in medicine, such as purgatives and bloodletting. Since there wasn't much information available at the time on mental health, speculating about it might have even implied dementia. It was simpler to label someone as mad or crazy than conduct a thorough scientific analysis of them. The list of reasons why a person could be admitted to a mental asylum were as varied as laziness and even being kicked in the head by a horse. In reality, insane asylums were rather prisons where patients were content as their families were unwilling or unable to take care of them. Was there another reason these mental asylums existed? Could they have been used for more than simply housing the lunatics and crazy people of that time? What if some were used to completely reprogram an unsuspecting society? Some online researchers and speculators have developed a theory that these institutions had a darker and more insidious purpose. What do we know about the cultural reset of the 1800s and the connection to insane asylums? Worldwide, some of the most architecturally notable insane asylums include the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, Britain, also known as Bedlam; Ipswich Hospital, Australia, for the insane; Danvers State Lunatic Asylum in Massachusetts, and Agnews Residential Facility in California to name a few. Unknown diseases could have contributed to some people's so-called insanity as well. In addition to the fact that many people claim to descend from an ancient kingdom, which for part of society indoctrinated by a questionable narrative, this was a clear sign of madness. It is taken for granted that, at the beginning and throughout the 1800s, there was no clear consensus of what mental health was or should be. So we can assume that being a healthy person was limited to acting according to the norms of social behavior. This is what most understood as not being crazy. By the end of the 19th century, national systems of regulated asylums for the mentally ill had been established in most industrialized countries. At the turn of the century, Britain and France combined had only a few hundred people in asylums. But by the end of the century, this number had risen to the hundreds of thousands. The United States housed 150,000 patients in mental hospitals by 1904. Germany housed more than 400 public and private sector asylums. These asylums were critical to the evolution of psychiatry as they provided places of practice throughout the world. Doctors, and especially ordinary people, did not understand what caused erratic or manic behaviors. So, there was no way to differentiate a person who really represented a danger to himself and society from one who had something different, and it would not be a medical issue. What if some people's insanity was simply a misdiagnosis of a distant memory of a previous society? Could these people have been reprogrammed to forget about their past? Mental asylums were at first a kindness to protect the sick from the world that would otherwise kill them. Within the theory of the cultural reset of the 1800s, we find that many of the asylums that were around the world and that would house all those who did not follow social norms used to be, in the remote past, buildings of a previous empire. As part of consolidating the reset, controllers separated the surviving families of the last world catastrophe that occurred. Perhaps they were moved around to different parts of the world or country after a great disaster such as a mud flood. It must be remembered that mud flood was most likely caused by planetary scale events such as super earthquakes or meteorite impacts, specifically in areas of rivers, valleys, and swamps. The theory claims that families that were indeed of previous lineage were to be systematically destroyed. Adults would be sent to newly discovered asylums where they would be essentially imprisoned and possibly psychologically affected in order to erase as much of their memories as possible. Online researchers claim that children would be sent to different parts of countries, far from home, or even to other countries with new identities to forget their cultural heritage. Adults who were more reluctant to forget their past could be subject to mental reprogramming. The asylums themselves, being of old world origin, possessed special qualities that controllers intentionally used to induce certain states of consciousness in people, perhaps even intended for people suffering from dementia or any other unidentified mental imbalance. The other blatantly obvious note is that these immense, insane asylums nearly look identical all around the world in what they call Gothic and Roman architecture. As the theory suggests by various online speculators, incredible as it may seem, ultimately the insane people were returned to the streets. There was supposedly a plan to finish getting them out of the way, disconnecting the people from their pasts. Supposedly, after the task at hand was complete, mental asylums inexplicably fell into disuse. It is worth mentioning that many of these mental asylums were buildings that looked partially submerged in the earth, as if in fact the ground level had buried an entire floor of the buildings and cities. Another main theme is most of these structures became overcrowded up through the beginnings of the 20th century, so more asylums were needed. Yet the population numbers at the time do not justify the immense size of the buildings or number of people they claim were committed. In California, at the very onset of the California Gold Rush of 1849, we see several insane asylums said to be erected to house those deemed insane, as early as 1851. Even though California's population in no way justified the immense size and scope of these structures, it's fair to ask yourself a few questions at this point. Were these complex mental asylums, of which, in many cases, there is no record of their foundation, and they seem to have an entire floor buried in the earth, where they built only by inexperienced men who pulled their resources with horses and carts. And even if it is possible, then they just let them fall into disuse. Some were remodeled through history as museums and other tourist attractions, many more demolished. Could it be that every century or so, society goes through a cultural reset that we collectively forget about? Were these asylums used to reprogram an entire generation to forget about a hidden past? We may never know the full story. Stay tuned for more next time. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up icon. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notifications for new videos. Was there a more advanced society among us before we even know? Is it possible that several architectural and engineering feats were already here before we arrived? This is the theory amongst a slew of online research coming out every day. What do we really know about the structures of our world that have served us for so long? Perhaps they were already here and simply discovered and repurposed. Or were they created by a previous civilization? Let's rewind to the 19th century. Power tools and heavy machinery were very uncommon, as they had only started to be used in the late part of the century. They weren't invented yet in the early 1800s or even up to the mid to late 1800s. Some of the most opulent feats of engineering are impossible to fathom how they were built by a simple horse and buggy society working with tools like spades, pickaxes, rakes, and hammers. All over North America, we find incredibly long and large canal systems that move large bodies of water to new directions to better serve us. 14-mile long and 450-foot wide canal systems were built at depths of 35 feet or more in places like Delaware. Considering the tools and manpower needed, this must have been an incredible feat for the early 19th century. Between 1817 and 1825, the Erie Canal was built. When it was first constructed, it was meant to be a whopping 363 miles long. This number is astounding. If this is broken down more simply, the builders were constructing almost a mile of canal per week. This is truly a stunning feat. Through forests, large rock escarpments, and various other challenges, the early 19th century builders managed to construct this massive structure at a pace simply unmatched today. Without modern machines or tools, they were able to complete this massive canal in under a decade. The system has 20 to 30 locks and several complex aqueducts. Researchers have tried to identify if there were any civil engineers in the country at the time, without any luck. Perhaps there weren't any. This massive accomplishment of architecture, engineering, construction, and sheer determinative manpower was, nonetheless, completed and is still being used today. There are numerous other examples of astounding accomplishments across our realm, many of them built in the early 19th century. Who were these highly skilled, determined workers of the early 19th century? Today, with all our modern technologies, many of these structures are simply too costly and expansive to be able to economically justify their construction. Let's use the megalithic rock theory to compare. In the world today, we find several precision-cut megaliths peppered across our realm, from Peru to Egypt and Turkey to Italy and even North America. Archaeologists in Lebanon have uncovered a megalith from the Phoenician era at a 2,000-year-old limestone quarry that weighs an estimated 1,000 tons. The megalith was first discovered by a farmer in the Bekaa Valley back in 1978, and it is believed to have been originally quarried sometime between 50 BC and 200 C. This is just one example of a precision-cut megalithic stone. If we can come to an understanding that societies thousands of years ago were able to cut and shape stones like this, why wouldn't a more recent civilization be able to achieve what we think is impossible today? Online research speculates that we may be suffering from a collective memory loss. Was there a more recent societal reset that we simply are not aware of today? Further to these megaliths, we can find impossible waterworks in ancient cathedrals and places of worship or ritual. Are we to believe that hunter-gatherer societies chiseled these waterworks out by hand? Why were they created in the first place? Many of them are a number of stories deep, but are so intricately designed, high-level planning must have been used. Is there more to the story that we simply do not know? These structures can range from hundreds to thousands of years old, and we simply don't have the answers as to who built them and how. What is the knowledge that we lost? Why are we not building such magnificence in modern-day structures? The similarities of all these types of architecture span across our realm. Between continents separated by oceans and mountains, we find overlapping architectural styles. How would this be possible without the ability to travel long distances quickly or easily? We didn't have modern communication in those days. Many societies may not have been able to travel at all. From Africa to Asia to Europe and the Americas, we see the similarities in arches, cathedrals, municipal buildings, and countless other examples. Were there travelers trading architectural designs and plans in the recent past? Is it possible there was a more singular group of more advanced people constructing and designing these buildings? In the mid-19th century, plans were underway to construct a system of tubes in London, England, that could carry items and people. The London Pneumatic Railway System. This was one of the first types of subway systems. The magnificence of this is that it was built in the 1800s and was essentially a Victorian-age Hyperloop system. Constructed by the London Pneumatic Dispatch Company, a simple steam engine ran this Hyperloop system, sending 3-ton carts through these tunnels with speeds up to 40 miles per hour. This was an absolute marvel of technology and engineering at the time. Surprisingly, the system was only used for 11 years between 1863 and 1874. Later, another company had also developed these tubes and carts that could travel between locations in the city in record time and up to 60 miles per hour, and had even carried passengers. The idea was to carry passengers and packages throughout the city to alleviate the traffic on the streets. With success, it operated, but for vague financial reasons, the project was shut down. Looking back to the 18th century and having a close look at the labor, tools, and sheer manpower needed to build anything like this is astonishing. Was the old world on its way to being a cleaner, greener place? From sacred geometry, free energy, and simple travel within cities, it seems as if though things were heading in a good direction. 19th century underground tube trains propelled by compressed air. This almost sounds like it is a made-up fairy tale, but it is in fact reality. How is this even possible with items like power tools not being invented until the late 1800s? The escalator wasn't invented until the 1890s. Keep in mind that the first hydraulic excavator wasn't invented until 1882. These builders had to bore tunnel systems throughout the undergrounds of entire cities before installing these hyperloops. How could this have even been done in a timely manner? At the time, the most common tools to bore tunnels were hammers and chisels. Yes, that's right, hammers and chisels, and pure manpower with the help of ox and horses, of course. Is there more to this than we simply do not know? How are these marvels of engineering and architecture possible to accomplish without the engineers, technology, and machinery we have today? Online researchers claim an advanced society did precede us and that this may not have been that long ago. Are we suffering from a collective memory loss? Only more research will bring us closer to the true story of the creation of our realm and our existence within it. Stay tuned for more next time. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up icon. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notifications for new videos. The 19th century was an era of mystery and intrigue when it came to photography and photo editing. In the absence of digital technology, photographers of the time had to rely on more primitive techniques to manipulate images. By hand, they would crop, tint, and retouch negatives to achieve the desired results. But what else did they do? Did they alter the content of the photographs to suit their own agendas? Can we trust the images we have of historical events as a true representation of the past? By the mid-1800s, photo editing was shrouded in mystery and secrecy. Photographers of the time were able to manipulate photographs to suit their own agendas, often without leaving a trace. The tools of their trade were primitive and the effects they could achieve were limited. But what kind of effects did they use? Were they able to add elements that were not present in the original frame? Did they airbrush out certain undesirable elements of a photograph? Were they able to make an image look older or more weathered than it really was? Or were techniques of the time simply limited to adjusting the brightness and contrast of a photograph? Through tinting, cropping, and retouching negatives, 19th century photographers could alter the content of a photograph to suit a specific purpose. They could add elements that were not present in the original frame, or airbrush out certain undesirable elements. In some cases, they even altered the color or texture of an image to make it look aged or weathered. But how far did these manipulations go? Can we trust the images we have of historical events as a true representation of the past? Were they able to edit out entire skies and buildings, making it almost impossible to detect the changes? Looking back, we can find examples of colleges of photography that pioneered the development of techniques for retouching photographs. These colleges' mission was to teach photographers how to manipulate images in various ways, such as tinting, cropping, and retouching negatives. This enabled photographers to create desired effects, such as adding elements to a photograph that weren't present or altering the color or texture of an image. They also taught photographers how to airbrush out certain undesirable elements of a photograph. This was particularly useful for retouching images to remove any blemishes or imperfections. Taught at these colleges, photographers used etching and modeling photo editing techniques to manipulate images in various ways. Through etching, photographers could create a high contrast, low relief effect in a photograph by darkening some areas and lightening others. This allowed photographers to emphasize certain details in a photograph, such as facial features and clothing. Modeling, on the other hand, was used to create a three-dimensional effect in a photograph. Photographers would use this technique to create the illusion of depth by manipulating the light and shadows in an image. This allowed photographers to make an image look more realistic and lifelike. These photo editing techniques were popular among 19th century photographers as they enabled them to manipulate images to suit their own agendas. They could make a photograph look older or more weathered than it really was. Or they could add elements that weren't present on the negative. We can find countless examples of these kinds of images sifting through the historical record. On closer inspection, we can see a number of expertly executed photo manipulation techniques. It seems as if though anything was possible. Just like Photoshop today, these old-world Photoshops were able to make someone smaller, change their facial structure, remove blemishes on faces, and even completely crop out objects from their hands, foregrounds, or backgrounds. The unfortunate issue we have today is that some of these photos may be taken as a direct and factual historical record. If this is the case, how can we ever decipher between which photos were completely real and which were edited? How can we know how much photo manipulation really took place? Another astounding discovery is the direct painting of objects within a photograph. Clearly, when we zoom in and inspect these photos on our screens, we can see the difference between reality and a painting. When we take a closer look at some of these photos, we can clearly see painted objects within them, from people, cars, and buildings themselves. There are numerous photos with other objects painted directly in them. Going back to etching and modeling, we can even find old-world copying and pasting techniques. Some of these historical photos we can identify clear-cut lines of copying and pasting from a completely different photo. We can follow these lines along the edges of these buildings and objects and see that the photo has been manipulated in a way to include objects not originally there. Some time ago, a mysterious theory began to circulate about a technique used by some photographers to manipulate images. This technique was referred to as the vanilla sky effect and was said to involve airbrushing out entire skies and buildings from a photograph. The result was a photograph that appeared to have been taken in a different location than it actually was. This allowed photographers to create images that were more aesthetical to them, perhaps, while also disguising the true location of the photo. But how true is this theory? What evidence is there to support it? Were photographers of the 19th century really able to airbrush out entire skies and buildings? If so, can we trust the images we have of historical events as a true representation of the past? Or were the techniques of the time simply limited to making small adjustments? The mysterious vanilla sky effect has been the subject of much speculation among photographers and historians. It is said to involve airbrushing out entire skies and buildings from a photograph to create a picture that appears to have been taken in a different location than it actually was. This enabled photographers to manipulate the content of a photograph to suit a specific purpose. For example, Victorian-era photographs of the London skyline often featured the same stretch of buildings and landmarks, making it appear as though the city hadn't changed in decades. It is widely believed that some of these photographs were manipulated using the vanilla sky effect to remove certain buildings and add others in order to create a more pleasing composition. What other evidence is there to support this theory? Were photographers of the 19th century really airbrushing out entire skies and buildings? And if so, for what purpose? The truth is, we may never know the full extent of the photo editing techniques used by 19th century photographers. We can only speculate as to how the images we have of the past were altered, and to what degree. However, one thing is certain. Some of the photographs of this era can't be taken at face value and should be viewed with a critical eye. Which ones? That is for you to decide. The Magic City. It's 1893 and the Chicago World's Fair opens its doors. Widely known as the Columbian Exposition, the 1893 World's Fair was a marvel of architecture, culture, and technology, all in one place. Today, we'll be taking a very close look at a book entitled The Magic City. It was published in 1894 by the Historical Publishing Company. It contains photographs of essentially every aspect of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. This fair and its history leaves us with many questions. Questions mainly surrounding feasibility. Was it possible to build such an incredible achievement of architecture in such a short period of time? Were there enough skilled workers? How did they know how to, and so skillfully, build these incredible and unique architectural styles in that period? Skeptics argue that the buildings were simply built from plaster and designed to only be temporary. While this may be true for some of them, there are a vast amount of incredibly large buildings that were not. This page specifically states the manufacturer's building was built with 17 million feet of lumber, 12 million pounds of steel, 2 million pounds of iron, and over 500,000 feet of glass. Let's make sure we heard that properly. 12 million feet of lumber. Typically for your average home, we can construct them today with about 6 board feet of lumber per square foot. We are not making any claims or speculating on any conclusions, but merely have a lot of questions about the absolute massiveness of this project. We must start our research by looking at the basic facts surrounding the Columbian Exposition. To start, let's look at Wikipedia and see some of the basic facts about the fair. The opening paragraph of the description reads, "The World's Columbian Exposition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, was a World's Fair held in Chicago in 1893 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus' arrival in the New World in 1492. The centerpiece of the fair, held in Jackson Park, was a large water pool representing the voyage Columbus took to the New World. Chicago had won the right to host the fair over several other cities, including New York City, Washington, D.C., and St. Louis. The exposition was an influential social and cultural event and had a profound effect on American architecture, the arts, American industrial optimism, and Chicago's image. To establish some basic facts about the fair, let's look at the numbers. How many buildings were built there? Wikipedia says nearly 200 new but deliberately temporary buildings were built. Keep that in mind. Deliberately temporary. Today, what organization, group, investor, or municipality would undergo such an unfathomable feat of attempting to build 200 temporary buildings? The cost was unfathomable and operated at a loss. What's also interesting is some of these photos have clearly been manipulated. Going back to our video about early photo manipulation and editing, this is clearly a photo that has been drawn into. Why would some of these photos be mixed with drawings? Is it possible that this is just an overexposure of some sort? It looks more like a drawing, but it is difficult to be certain. Keep in mind that this was the late 1800s. This wasn't the Renaissance. There wasn't an abundance of skilled artisans walking around that were not only skilled craftsmen, but also artists themselves. To successfully manage a large group of unskilled workers to complete such incredible detail in architecture would be a feat in itself, especially without any prior training. Let's take a look at the planning and organization section. Reading through the entire section, it seems to omit a couple pieces of pertinent information. First, how long did it take to build? It doesn't say. Next, who built all these buildings? It also doesn't mention the number of workers and types of artisans and skilled trades required to build these structures. It mentions the architects, the planning, and the financial dealings, but nothing about the actual construction of the fair. In order to find some more facts about the fair, such as how long it took to build and how many people, we must look elsewhere. We will be able to find this information on the Encyclopedia Britannica website under the biography of Daniel Burnham, the American architect. The encyclopedia quotes, "In little more than 2 years, working with America's most noted architects and designers, Burnham developed America's most spectacular World's Fair of the 19th century. He led a workforce that reached 10,000 men." So we know a few more facts now. We know there were over 200 buildings built. Let's just use 200 as the total number for the rest of this video. We know it took just over 2 years to construct. We also know that at its peak, the workforce encompassed 10,000 men. Unfortunately, it is difficult to find anything else about who these men were and how they acquired the skills required to build all these buildings. Nevertheless, there was 10,000 men at the peak of construction. This also implies that there may have been less at other times. 10,000 was the most they had at a given time. So this could perhaps imply that there could have been 5, 6, 7, or 8,000 at other times. We will still use the highest number for some rudimentary calculations. If there was 10,000 men, that built 200 buildings in 2 years. This means that about 50 men worked on each of those buildings on average. If we want to split that up equally, let's take a look at the most common construction tools in the 1890s. Keep in mind, power tools were not invented until 1895 and took some time to become widely used. Only hand tools were available at the time and more than likely used by the common construction worker. Let's fast forward to the modern day for a minute. Some basic questions that come to mind, considering this feat was almost a century and a half ago, is how does it compare to today's standards? How long does it take for an architect to draw up plans for a commercial building today? According to multiple architecture-related websites, the average number we see the most is about 4 months. Today, it takes an architect potentially up to 4 months to draw and design a standard commercial building. A basic residential home may take less but could also take a month or 2. We don't know the total number of architects that worked on the fair, but it would had to have been many. Next question that comes to mind is how many laborers does it take to build a standard house? According to Plumber's Disposal, it can take anywhere between 26 to 32 different workers to simply build a residential home today. Most people know that a home can take from anywhere between 6 months to 2 years to build. This includes landscapers, excavators, framers, masons, wall installers, cleaners, carpenters, floor installers, roofers, and more. Let that sink in for a second. 26 to 32 workers is typical over the course of a single residential home construction project over a time of 6 months to 2 years. Today, we have heavy machinery excavators, concrete forms, power tools, pre-cut and milled lumber, and electricity on the job site. Rewind back to 1893. Almost a century and a half ago, there were no power tools, there were no massive excavators. There was a low supply of extremely highly skilled artisan construction workers. Most people built and lived in cabins like this unless you lived in a city. Life was short, difficult, and construction was basic at best. Literally a roof over your head to survive each season as they come. Meanwhile, at the World's Fair, some 10,000-odd construction workers built some of the most marvelous and intricate architecture ever seen. How this marvelous feat of architecture was accomplished is nothing short of a miracle. Is there more to the story that we don't know? Was there other tools and technology in use that we may not know of? One thing we know for sure is it was a marvelous accomplishment one way or another. The Great Fires of the 19th century remain a mysterious, unsolved mystery. Who was behind these devastating blazes and what could have been their motive? How did the fires spread so quickly and with such intensity, leaving entire cities in ruins? What secrets could these fires be hiding? What answers still remain to be discovered in the charred remains of the past? The great fires that have burned entire cities in North America are vast and mysterious occurrences, leaving behind destruction and devastation. What caused these fires? What were the consequences? How have these cities rebuilt afterwards? These great fires of the 19th century are a powerful reminder of the destruction that can be wrought by a single spark. The first great fire occurred in the year 1871 in the city of Chicago. The cause of the fire remains unknown, but the effects were far-reaching. The blaze wiped out entire neighborhoods and left around 90,000 people homeless. But what caused the fire? Was it an accident, or was there something more sinister at play? Some believe that the fire was an act of arson, potentially as a form of revenge against the city. Rumors of conspiracies swirled after the fire, with some pointing to suspicious behavior prior to the blaze. Others believe that the fire was the result of a terrible accident. Still, some believe that the fire was started intentionally by a group of individuals with a sinister agenda. Could someone or some group have wanted to destroy the city and its people? Was the fire a coordinated effort to cause chaos and destruction? This great fire ushered in a new era. According to National Geographic, the 1871 fire sparked the Great Rebuilding, as they called it. The Great Rebuilding was the effort to construct a new urban center. Big businesses, innovative buildings, and a new style of architecture were the results. Interesting, right? A new style of architecture was implemented because of the devastation of the fire. What do they mean by a new style of architecture? Why had the centuries old styles of architecture become phased out for a new form of a type of brutalism? In a sense, the Great Rebuilding of Chicago is shrouded in more mystery and intrigue. Who were the masterminds behind the massive urban transformation of the Windy City during the 19th century? What were their motives? How did they manage to pull off such an ambitious project? The Great Rebuilding of Chicago began in 1871 with the Great Fire and ended in 1893 with the opening of the World's Columbian Exposition. Yes, you heard that right. It started with the fire and ended with the World's Fair of 1893. This period between one of the greatest fires and one of the greatest World's Fairs in history was called the Great Rebuilding. In between, the city underwent an unprecedented transformation. The city's downtown area was completely redesigned with the construction of a new commercial district and the expansion of the city's railroads. Hundreds of new buildings were erected. The Great Rebuilding is often associated with the rise of the Chicago School of Architecture and the vision of Daniel Burnham, one of the city's most important architects. Burnham was the mastermind behind the development of the city's White City, also known as the World's Fair, of neoclassical and Beaux Arts buildings. He hoped it would become an icon of modernity and progress. But while Burnham's vision was certainly influential in the city's transformation, it was only one facet of the larger story. The Great Rebuilding of Chicago was a complex project involving numerous players. While many of them remain unknown, certain individuals have become synonymous with the project. Foremost among them is Philip D. Armour, a meatpacking magnate who was a major force in the city's transformation. Armour was a major investor in the city's new railroads, and his investments provided the financial backbone for the Great Rebuilding. The barons came to the rescue, but beyond the well-known figures, there have long been rumors of darker forces at work. Some believe that the Great Rebuilding was part of a secret plan to manipulate the city's political and economic power. Was the Great Fire deliberately set to create the opportunity for a massive urban transformation? Who were the mysterious forces behind the project? What were their ultimate goals? The truth of the Great Rebuilding of Chicago remains as mysterious as ever. But while the answers may never be known, the sheer scale and ambition of the project can be appreciated. According to Wikipedia, there were almost 100 great fires in North America across various major cities. Let that sink in. 100 great fires, ranging from Detroit to Buffalo and Charleston, all the way up to St. John's, Newfoundland. The entire continent was on fire. Let's take a closer look at the Great Boston Fire of 1872. According to the official information, to quote Wikipedia, the Great Boston Fire of 1872 was Boston's largest fire and still ranks as one of the most costly fire-related property losses in American history. The conflagration began at 7:20 p.m. on Saturday, November 9, 1872, in the basement of a commercial warehouse on Summer Street. The fire was finally contained 12 hours later, after it had consumed about 65 acres of Boston's downtown, 776 buildings and much of the financial district, and caused $73 million in damage. Let's go over that again. Contained in 12 hours. Does that sound possible? Looking into more references, it is completely true. In fact, the Great Fire of Boston in 1872 started at 7 a.m. on November 9, 1872, and was contained by midday the following day on November 10th. Let's remind ourselves that firefighting equipment was limited to brute manpower, pull carts and horse and buggies containing limited amounts of water and hoses. Fortunately, the Boston Fire Department is said to have 11 steam-powered engines at the time. Yet, with these incredibly rudimentary pieces of equipment, a fire spanning 776 buildings over 65 acres was contained in 12 hours. Another incredible fact is the low number of fatalities, given the circumstances. In all of the 776 buildings that burned, over the entire 65 acres of land, it is said that between 13 to 20 people had unfortunately succumbed to the fire, including 2 firefighters, for an inferno that spread to 65 acres in under 12 hours, covering 776 buildings. This is miraculous. It does not seem the patrons of these buildings were evacuated either, but rather, the story is said that up to 100,000 lined the streets to watch the fire from surrounding neighborhoods and to loot the commercial establishments. Trying to piece the events together logically simply leaves you with more questions than answers. Fast forward to 1883, and what do we have in Boston? Another World's Fair. According to Wikipedia, the American exhibition of the products, arts and manufactures of foreign nations was held in Boston in 1883 and 1884 in the Mechanics Hall. It was the World's Fair in America that had hosted the most foreign exhibitors at that time, including China and Japan. Between the years of 1872 and 1883, the city also went through a rebuilding of sorts that constructed some of the iconic architecture seen in the city today. The great fires of the 19th century have been shrouded in mystery and intrigue ever since they first occurred. Theories range from natural causes to mass conspiracies, and there is evidence to suggest that some of the fires were deliberately set. Who was behind these fires and why remain open questions? Was it a single individual or a group of people, and what were their motives? Were they acting alone, or was there a greater organization at play? Was the goal to create chaos, force change, or something else entirely? What was the result of these fires, and how did they shape the future? The great fires of the 19th century have left many unanswered questions, and only through further investigation can we begin to uncover the truth. Stay tuned for more next time. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up icon. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notifications for new videos.